we're going to talk about server-side rendering, generally speaking in web applications, but also specifically in Django. All right, so just starting out here, I've skipped a couple steps just so you don't have to watch me repeating the same setup that we've been doing throughout the whole week. Although you're going to have to repeat it for your homework tonight, I just didn't want to make you watch me do it in this lecture. So I've created a new Django. Well, first I created a virtual environment called templating. You can see that it's already active at my command line here. So that's set up. I've created a Django project called templating and then created this notes file that's almost empty, but that's all I've done so far. Don't even have any Django apps yet, so we're gonna have to do that next before I actually start writing any code. So I've got my basic folder structure set up already. Now, as I often like to do, this lecture is going to be kind of split up into two parts. The first part is going to be more conversational, more theoretical, hoping that you ask a lot of questions, going to kind of understand broadly how the web ecosystem works. There's different choices that people make in designing their applications. And then towards the end, I'm going to show more practically how we would implement some of these ideas using Django's templating system. So first of all, just for context, most web applications need to render dynamic content. So, the web wouldn't be very interesting if every page was the same for every visitor every time they visited. So generally, when a user, especially a logged in user, sends a request to a web application, the application needs to get necessary data from various sources, such as APIs or databases, or from the request itself, and then insert that data into a template, which gets rendered into HTML. We're talking about dynamic content here. But an important design decision that you'll make as a developer is when do these variables get inserted into the template? So generally speaking, there are two different approaches to getting data into your templates. There is server-side rendering. This is what we've been doing with Django so far. And so I'm going to be talking about this in a little bit more depth, and we're going to explore some more advanced server-side rendering concepts towards the end of today's lecture. But then I can't really talk about server-side rendering without contrasting it with the obvious alternative, which is client-side rendering. So we're not going to be doing client-side rendering today. We're going to be using React to do client-side rendering in later weeks of this bootcamp. But it's important to me that you understand the difference between them, that these are two options you have for rendering your content. And in different situations, you might prefer one over the other. I feel like a problem that I've observed a lot in a lot of junior developers from recent years, this is especially something you see in bootcamp graduates, is that people are only taught client-side rendering. But this is kind of a newer, more complex way of sending your content to the front end. And so I think it's really a shame that people don't know kind of the traditional way of rendering content on the server, which is honestly how most websites still work. not like your trendy web applications, like GitHub and Netflix or whatever. But this is still a really fundamental technique that you need to understand in order to be a responsible web developer. In order to actually choose the right tool for the job, you need to know more than one tool. So broadly, we're going to be talking about two different approaches to rendering content. So server-side rendering, this is the most traditional and simplest way to make a dynamic web page because there's no front-end framework involved like React. So this is where your server itself is taking the variables from your API, your database, or wherever, and then inserting them into your template and then rendering raw HTML on the server. So when it gets to the client never even knew there was a template. They didn't even know that there were variables. They just get plain HTML. See, also server-side rendering is generally easier to think about as well, because once the HTML gets to the client, it's just plain HTML and it doesn't keep changing based on the user interaction. It's only dynamic on the server because we're not running Python in the user's browser. So this makes it easier to think about and it's less complex to implement. But of course, this is also the main downside of server-side rendering, is that it's not dynamic on the client side. So also, server-side rendering is, generally speaking, faster for the first page load to your website. Because with a traditional server rendered page, the server is going to send down the HTML first, and then the client can start rendering that HTML as soon as they get it. I don't think they even have to download the entire HTML document. They can start rendering it progressively as pieces of it download. And then later on, they can send more requests for like the CSS, for scripts and images, but like the scripts can be deferred. We can run those later. What's most important is that we get the HTML as fast as possible so that the user gets to look at something. So unfortunately, even though our initial page load is pretty fast, our subsequent page loads are only slightly faster. It's possible that they might be faster because the user is caching our CSS. So, if they already download it on the first page, they don't have to download the same CSS file on the second page. But for the most part, all the work that we do in rendering our first page when the user visits our site is the same work we have to do on subsequent page loads.
Is that the same concept as having loading screens on games? So like basically you're keeping them entertained while the thing itself is loading.
So in this case, while it's loading, like when you move from one page to the next, the user just gets a blank screen because that's how browsers work. When you go from one server generated route to another, it's going to unload the entire page, forget all your JavaScript variables, and you load them in fresh on the next one. So the developer doesn't really have to do anything deliberate there. The user kind of knows that they're waiting because they see a blank page and like, you know, you see the little spinny icon up here on the top. Everyone can see that when I refresh the page as it's loading, you get that spinny thing. That's not something I had to develop. That's just how browsers work when a server generated page is loading. So in some ways, the user gets some clues about the page loading without you actually having to do anything deliberate. So that's the feature of a server-side rendering. What you're talking about with like loading pages and spinners, that's going to be necessary when we talk about client-side rendering in just a minute. All right. So this might seem like not a great trade-off. Like I'm telling you that the initial page load is fast, and then the subsequent page loads are not as fast as we would like. But remember that on the web, first impressions are very important. The very first visit to your site that someone makes is the one you want to optimize the most. There are those statistics, like if someone spends more than 2 seconds loading your site, they're probably just going to back out and never come back to it. And then another concept that I want to introduce here is the notion of above the fold content versus below the fold content. Because I was saying how with server-side rendering, we're actually able to load the HTML document from top to bottom. We don't have to wait for everything to finish. You can kind of strategize about the order that the content loads sometimes. So generally, you want to prioritize loading content as quickly as possible if it's on the initial page and they don't have to scroll to see it. That's called above the fold content. So when you're thinking about how you want to render information, this is a consideration to think about sometimes. What order, like what all has to download before we can show the user anything. And so you'll often want to prioritize things that they're going to see first or going to notice first, or that they'll want to interact with immediately. If there's some JavaScript widget on the bottom of the page, you can load that last because they're probably not going to see it until they scroll through the page. They're not going to want to click on it until they read it. So you can deprioritize that. Honestly, as you're trying to like improve the performance of your web applications, some of it is going to be technical, trying to make your code run faster. A lot of it is really psychological, just making people feel more comfortable with waiting, or just presenting the content in a different order so that they're able to do something meaningful faster, even if not all the content is ready. Kat?
I just wanted to ask, I've seen references to like lazy loading. Is that what this refers to?
It does, yeah, that's a related concept actually. So I'm gonna talk about that a little bit when we get to client-side rendering in just a second. It's good that you're making that connection though. Do we have any other questions? Real quick. Okay, cool. So this is kind of the basics of server-side rendering. That's what we're going to be that's what we've been doing with Django templates. That's what we're going to be doing later today. But just so you understand, the decisions that are being made when you choose server-side rendering, I need to contrast it with client-side rendering, which is what we're going to learn about with React. So client-side rendering, this is a newer style of rendering web pages. It's made feasible by front-end frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue. Now, I say feasible because technically this is possible to do with a vanilla JavaScript. React doesn't let you do anything that's not already possible in the browser, but it's a lot harder to do this with vanilla JavaScript. The reason why these frameworks came into existence is because people were struggling with client-side rendering and they wanted tools to make it easier. So in a client-side rendered app, the big difference, instead of variables being inserted into your template on the server just sends the template down to the client and then also sends the data variables down to the client. And then the client, the browser, puts the variables into the template, generates HTML, and then uses JavaScript to put the HTML onto the screen. So that's client-side rendering. This is how React is going to work. Honestly, a lot of the templating techniques that I'm going to talk about today, you can apply them also to React. It's really the same concept, whether you generate on the server side or the client side. There's going to be slightly different syntax, but the general theoretical concept that I'm talking about how you can organize your code, that'll work both on the client or on the server, however your templates are getting rendered. Andrew?
So for big websites, if they do stuff client side, is there much less server load in their whatever, all the connections coming through?
Ideally, yes. That is one of the goals, I think, of client-side rendering. Doesn't always work out that way, but in theory, you should be able to achieve that. So yeah, let's dig into that a little bit here. So imagine if you're on a server-side rendered app, you request one page. And then if you want to go to a different page, your browser is going to forget everything that was already loaded and then request a new page, even if there are a lot of similarities. So the header, the footer, nav bar, or whatever, those are probably exactly the same from one page to the next, but your browser is still going to download them from the server. So that's extra data you're downloading, and you're still going to recreate that in your browser. So that's extra work for the client. But then also the browser is going to send additional requests for all the CSS files, the JS, the images in that new page. So that one request actually turns into several more requests. Whereas in a client-side rendered app, once you're already on the first page, going to a second page doesn't require unloading the whole page. You just send a simple request asking for some JSON, and then the server sends back a small JSON object, not an entire HTML page. And then that's it. You don't need to send more subsequent requests for related files, JavaScript, images, whatever. everything the client needs at that point is contained in that JSON response. And then you can feed that data into the template and render new HTML. So ideally, if you're building everything, intelligently, a client-side rendered application should be able to change pages without exchanging as much data and without quite as many requests to the server. Andrew?
Sorry, I have just an extension of a question. So before we get into it, are there hybrid solutions where like the first connect to website can be server side, and then afterwards we switch the user to like a client side one?
Yes, there are hybrid solutions, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Definitely a very good question. I hope you always think about things like that. Very few things in technology, I think, are black and white. There are often hybrid solutions or compromises they'll have to make. And I feel like when people talk in very black and white terms about technology, like you should never do this, always do that, that to me is a red flag that they don't really understand what they're talking about. They just read a blog post. So I want you all to be able to make intelligent decisions and understand trade-offs. So let's see here. So I was saying, ideally, a client-side rendered app can change pages, less load on the server. All right, so ideally, a client-side rendered application is able to change pages with less server load, just because there's less data that has to move back and forth. So this also makes the experience faster for the client. So in a well-structured client-side rendered app, you can change pages very fast. And it's actually kind of funny because some client-side rendered apps change pages too fast. Like someone will click a button and then not even realize that the page changed because like they blinked as soon as they click the button and they don't like know that they're in a different place. And I think the app is just broken. So this is like a real problem that people have. And the solution is people will add pretty animations to the page transitions that have artificial delays in them. So I think it's kind of funny because like the client-side rendering is too fast. So you artificially make it slower. So it's a little bit more like a server rendered page where you get some like visual effect, the page blanks out, turns white. Although for a client-side rendered app, you could actually like put a spinner in the page so that the user understands that they're waiting for something. And honestly, if the page transition is not fast, like maybe your server is just really slow, it's taking a long time to generate that JSON response for some reason. In that case, the loading spinner is much more important because like I said before, this little spinny circle thing here in my browser tab, that only works for server-side routes. If there's some AJAX request that's taking a long time and that's what's preventing a page transition, there's no default way that that's communicated to the user. So I would have to use some kind of like a spinner or other loading graphic to let them know that the page is still waiting. All right, so again, the loading spinner doesn't actually make your page any faster, but it makes it much less likely that someone's just going to leave your website randomly because it's slow or not working. So that's definitely very important to remember. So contrasting this with server-side rendering, client-side rendering is a bit more complicated. Because there's just another framework you need to use. For client-side rendering, we'll use React on top of Django. We can't avoid using Django, but if we were doing a server-side rendered application, we wouldn't need React. So like we said before, client-side rendering is more complicated, but it's great because your content on the front end is dynamic. Sometimes that's exactly what you want. Like if that is what you're trying to achieve, is have dynamic front end content without refreshing the page, then you need client-side rendering for that. Oh, so backing up, the page transitions are fast, but the initial page load for a client-side rendered app is going to be slower because you need to download all of the content before you can show the user anything. If you're using JavaScript to render the HTML, you can't render it like paragraph by paragraph, div by div as it loads. You have to load all of the content into JavaScript. The entire script file needs to be loaded, and then you can actually generate it on the page. But so that takes a lot longer. The page has to set up more things then before it's actually ready to show content. So I believe Kat mentioned earlier, there's an exception to this. Some client-side rendered apps use a technique called lazy loading, which means that on the initial page load, the client only actually gets the template for that home page, and then it'll request the templates for other pages only if the user transitions there. So in some ways, this forfeits some of the benefits of client-side rendering because it's going to make your page transition slower because now you have to request that template just in time right before you go to that new page. But then it also gives you some of the advantages of server-side rendering in that your initial page load is not going to be quite so slow. The user is only downloading the things that they need for that page. So again, everything is all about trade-offs, and this is a compromise within a compromise here. So one last bit of jargon, an acronym here about client-side rendering. You've probably heard this before. In many client-side rendered applications, they have exactly one server route. So there's one route at the home page, and this serves all of the JavaScript containing the entire rest of the web page. And then furthermore, In addition to just using JavaScript to render content on the page, we're going to use JavaScript to rewrite the URL to indicate to the user where they are in the app. Because remember, if there's only one server route and it's at slash, that means that as the user is clicking around, navigating through our app, the URL is not going to change. So that's just kind of a missed opportunity. You know, we could be putting useful information there, and instead we're not. And it also makes it hard for the user to like go back and forward or to link to a specific part of our application from outside of it. So it's important that even though we're not really using server rendered routes, we still want the URL bar to indicate the state of our application. Ivan?
So is this like, I don't know if this is the cause of the issue, but like if you go on LinkedIn and you like click on a post and you click back, it won't go back to the next page. It'll just go back before you open the pop-up, if that makes sense. So like, is that kind of why it's doing that? Because like you see a profile picture, you click on the picture, it pops up, you click backspace, it doesn't go back to the next page. It just closes that model, whatever you're going to call it.
Mhm.
Is that like the reason why?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on here. Somebody decided to reinvent the internet, and they, used a client-side rendered solution instead of just doing traditional server rendered pages. And that means that, some of the default functionality of your browser might not work the way you expect it to because they have to re-implement it. So like back, for example, back may or may not do what you're expecting it to do depending on how the client-side rendering was implemented. So definitely one of my biggest frustrations with the modern internet is poorly built client-side rendered apps that like violate my expectations about what my browser does, like back and refresh and just history, right-clicking on things, that kind of stuff. Yeah, really great observation. So even though the URL didn't change normally, so we call this a single page application, or SPA. All content is generated client side, and the URL gets rewritten with JavaScript. So, you're clicking through the app and it's just using JavaScript to send a request to the server and just get a little bit of JSON back to replace a part of the website. And so even though the server is not actually like seeing that as a page transition, like you're not going to different routes, in JavaScript on the front end, we can still change the URL bar so that from the user's perspective, it still looks like they're going to different pages, they're going to different routes. But that is like kind of magic. It's basically hacking the URL bar. We'll get into that in a little bit more depth when we cover React and client-side rendering. All right, so real brief, just want to talk about some of these hybrid solutions. So I think as Andrew was asking before, if they're hybrid solutions. So yes, you don't have to choose one or the other. For one, you can choose one or the other in different parts of your site. So a pattern that I've seen in some places is that parts of your site that do not require login, such as the login and sign up page, marketing pages, about, contact, FAQ, that kind of stuff is rendered server side. Because server-side rendered pages generally have better SEO, and that's going to be faster for your first-time users. So that kind of optimizes more for the kinds of people who are going to go to your marketing page. But then after a user has logged in, you send them a single-page application that has all of the other content for your app that only a logged in user should have access to. So that's one way I've seen that split up. And use client-side rendering for the rest of the app requires login. So this is just one suggestion of a hybrid solution. There are other ways you might organize it. My point is just, this is possible. It's a thing you can do. Joseph, question?
Yeah, I know you said we'd talk about it more later, but just for my sanity, for something that uses a lot of user feedback, loading the entire thing under one URL wouldn't be appropriate, correct?
What do you mean user feedback?
So like a, let's think like a e-commerce site, where you have to select sizes and colors and all that, and then enter your information to actually purchase it. That wouldn't really be feasible to load it all under one route, right?
Sure, you could.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Yep. You can, it seems like we're stuffing a lot into a small place, but with the magic of JavaScript, we can still keep all that complexity organized, even though from our server's perspective, there's only one route. This is one interesting thing, honestly, about modern development. I don't know how I feel about it, but the web used to have a lot of complexity in a lot of different places, and now it's kind of all being crammed into JavaScript. Our JavaScript is going to be pretty complex, whereas the other parts of our stack are going to be less complex than maybe they would be 5-10 years ago. Okay, so also hybrid solutions, you can do both at the same time. So I think Andrew was asking about this. You can have the server render your content, insert data into your template, send down plain HTML, but then also have JavaScript on the front end that is able to edit it after the fact based on user interactions. So in some ways, this is the best of both worlds between client-side and server-side rendering, in that you get that fast initial page load, and then you also have dynamic front-end content. The big downside is that this is the most complicated way that you can render your content. So I would only do it if you think it's worthwhile, or if you think you can manage the complexity. Andrew?
I'm a little confused on what exactly does dynamically mean in this case? Is it just like variables are getting sent to the web page and it switches based off of it?
Yeah, dynamically basically just means that it changes. So, either you're sending a request to the backend is going to give you some new data, and then you incorporate that data into your template without refreshing the page, or maybe the user is interacting with the page. That's going to be a really great strength of React over what we can just do with Django, is that the user can interact with the page, and then we can change the HTML based on that without sending a request back to the backend. So yeah, I'm just saying that if we want the content to change in any way, using JavaScript. Sound good?
Yeah, after the content changes, when the page is given to you, at that point, do we call it a static page?
If it was rendered server side, and then you're saying once we're looking at on the front end, I'm not sure how I would talk about that. I guess I would say that it's static on the front end and it's only dynamic on the back end. Maybe someone else would talk about it differently. I think people who are more old school would say it's dynamic because you've got server-side rendering and it doesn't matter where the dynamic stuff happens. Maybe someone who's more like new school would insist that it changes in JavaScript on the front end to truly be considered dynamic. I don't know. Brendan?
Raphael, I have a question and the distinction between the two in terms of, and I think you kind of talked about it before, but to make it a little bit more clear in my head, for the different types, front end and back end or server side, the processing power and computer, I guess, hardware that's being used more in one versus the other. So like on in the hybrid solutions or the front end stuff, is the user's hardware going to be taxed more?
For sure.
And that's so like all the instances of whatever web page is really just being derived based on whatever they have available to them. Vice on the static side, like if you're making a program that takes in more difficult computations or uses a lot more, processing power, you would need to factor in what the users have available, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. If you're doing like really complex math in order to generate your HTML, that's probably hard to do client side. So you either want server rendered HTML or just have the server do the math and then give the client the output and then have the client render that into the HTML. But it's definitely, like, I would say, a problem in a lot of modern websites is that the developer builds a single page application on their like $2,000 desktop machine and they think it's really fast. And then, someone uses a 5-year-old Android phone and they try to load it and it's just crawling. They can barely get like the first half the page to load because that client-side rendered app is putting a lot more load on their phone. And maybe, 5 years ago when that phone was released, these kinds of frameworks didn't exist, or like people weren't building websites that were quite as heavy as they are now. All right, so if we want to do this hybrid solution, doing both at the same time, more complicated. However, there are some frameworks that have this concept in mind of rendering on both the server side and the client side, and so they can make this easier. So for example, Next.js is a framework on top of React. So it's like a framework for a framework, kind of. And then similarly, there's something called Nuxt.js for Vue, which I don't expect you're going to look into. My point is just that there are a handful of different tools that help people do this. This is kind of one of the newer trends in web development, I would say. People are trying to find better and better ways to do both client-side and server-side rendering simultaneously. Okay, so that's all the boring theory stuff I've got to show you. Why don't we, if there aren't any more questions, let's take a 8 or 9 minute break. And then I'm going to show you how to apply some of these concepts in our Django templates. Any questions? No questions? Going once, going twice? All right. So let's come back at 11:20. Very sorry. Thank you for reminding me. Please don't feel shy to speak up if I, say 2 words without recording. All right. Anyways. So I've created my I've created my app for the blog. But so remember, all of the requests coming into my app, my project initially, they come into the urls.py. So I'm going to have to direct this over to my blog, let it know what URLs blog is supposed to be handling. Just a second. So yeah, we're just going to add another path here. I'm going to do this at the root route. So I want the blog to actually be like the main homepage, you know, the front door of my website. So I'm going to say that the blog is going to handle the root route. We will include blog.urls. So this is a file that doesn't exist yet, does it? Right, so I'm gonna have to create that in just a moment. Also, we need to import include. So it's not defined by default. All right, so that comes from Django.urls along with path. So I define that up there. Okay, so now requests coming into urls.py should go to blog.urls. So we'll have to make that file. urls.py. Okay, so now at the root of my server, just slash the home page, we're going to serve index. But of course, this has not been defined yet, so I'll have to do that next. Also, path needs to be imported. So again, I get that from Django.urls. All right, so now I will create my actual view function in the views.py file. And all route handler functions take a request object as their input. All right, now every time we render a request, we pass the request object into it, and then we need to specify the template that we are rendering. And so again, I've referred to a file that I've not yet created. So that's the very next thing I'm going to do here. Like we talked about the other day, there's a pretty rigid naming convention that Django uses. So inside of my blog app folder here, I'm going to create a new folder called templates, and that is what it must be named, templates. And then inside of there, to continue our organization, I'm going to make another folder called blog that corresponds to the app. So I made this subfolder to match the app blog. That's part of the Django conventions for your folder structure. I can talk about that more in depth, but I'm happy to just move on at this point. And then inside of there, we're going to make our index.html. Okay, so at this point, I should have enough code written that I can actually run my server and see this in my browser, I think. So let's try doing that. You'll note that I've already got my virtual environment set up here. All right, I am now running my server. It's at localhost 8000. So let's see that go. Template does not exist. What is the problem here?
It's because you put template, not templates.
Where are you seeing that?
Or you have templates with an S, not template.
For the folder name?
Yeah, because it says template does not exist.
The folder name does need to be templates with an S. But it's telling me you can't find this file blog/index.html. Just not what I was expecting. Index.html.
Did you add in blog as a installed app in the settings?
I did not. That is definitely important. Thank you very much. So I created an app. Django does not automatically know about new apps that you create. So that is an important step in this whole process that is easy to forget. Sorry, just double checking something here real quick. All right, so I've added the blog as an installed app. I restarted my server. Let's try this again. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much for that suggestion there. It's weird because usually Django just relies on convention. You just put things in the right place and it knows what to do. But in this case, you do have to tell it like, hey, this is an app, I've added it. Anyway, so we can see now I'm rendering this page. So welcome to my blog. Let's do some more interesting things with this page, actually do some templating like I've been talking about. So generally, when you're talking about rendering templates, turning data into HTML, there are a few basic problems that you need to solve, no matter what framework you're dealing with. These are just kind of the basic problems of rendering content. So the first one, this is going to be real simple, a little bit review for you, honestly, but is just variable interpolation. So you've got some data, you've got a template, you need to insert that string or number or whatever into your template somewhere and present it to your user. So this is a blog. Let's have a little bit of data about our user. And I'm just going to declare this in an object here, or sorry, in a dictionary. All right, so here we've got this basic user object. I want to incorporate this data into my rendered template here. Now remember, our templates don't automatically have access to all the data that's defined in Python in the request. The templates only have access to what we explicitly pass in. So if I want to use this dictionary in my request, I'm just going to pass her in user. Now, if I want to make use of this, I'm going to go back to my template. Let's say hopefully this is review for all of you. This is just how we insert variables into a template in Django. This is pretty basic, but it's also like really core. This is really fundamental. This is worth reviewing because this is the first most basic thing you need to do. All right, so now we're inserting this data into our template and it's being rendered dynamically, so that's great. So that's just generally interpolation. The second problem that you need to solve in templating is conditional rendering. So you have some piece of data, some piece of HTML that you want to show only sometimes. So I'm going to make this data structure a little bit more complicated. Let's imagine, in a real life situation, if this is like a user object coming from our database, we should have some indication if a user is logged in or not. So I'm just going to add a property here, is logged in. Set that to true for now. And this actually pretty closely resembles how authentication in Django is actually handled. You're going to get a user object that'll have a property, is logged in, true or false, and you're going to have to, do some clever logic based on that. So now let's say that this is like a private blog, kind of like it's on Medium, maybe. You have to log in, you have to sign up for Medium in order to read blogs on the site. So even though it's a blog, she's trying to, broadcast her message out to anyone who'll listen. You do have to log in. So we're going to check if the user is logged in. So again, for any kind of logic or flow control in Django, in the Django templates, we use this kind of a bracket % syntax. And we also have to end it, which is different from Python. But in these Django templates, there's no other way it knows when the if statement ends. So we need this end if. But now we're actually checking the data that we're getting in to see if the user is logged in. And we're only rendering this if that's the case. So currently they are logged in, so that doesn't change anything about how this content renders. But if we just change this, say instead our user is not logged in, now they don't see anything. All that content was only available to users with is logged in equals true. So now we're using conditional rendering to not show them information that wouldn't make sense. If they're not logged in, you don't know what their username or email is or any of their personal data. So you can't really show them a dashboard or anything. Well, I guess here you're looking at Alice's information, but still we're hiding her information if you're not logged in, because that's just how her blog works. Ivan?
So because it's kind of generated in the back end, is this kind of like also a little more secure in terms of like not showing the information? So like you can't just inspect and then just change is logged in to true, right? Like I won't be able to just kind of like easily just inspect the element, make it true, and then now it'll show me the post, or would it still be able to do that?
So that's a really good question. There are definitely some like really crappily made applications where they would download the entire post and then hide it based on is logged in. And then you could just, tinker with the JavaScript or maybe even just in the HTML and then reveal something that was supposed to be hidden. A slightly smarter application would first check if you're logged in and then only request the actual content of the article if you're actually logged in, so that it's a little bit harder to like steal that information. But also then on the server, it would double check your login. So you would need to have like a valid cookie, some valid like authentication credentials. You wouldn't be able to just set like is logged in true and have like a sophisticated website get tricked by that. So it's definitely good to think about. It'll work sometimes, but there are definitely techniques that the developers can use to prevent people from hacking them so easily. Does that help?
It does, it does.
Cool. All right, so now I don't like it when we just show them nothing, just a blank screen if they're not logged in. So we want to give them some information about why they're not seeing anything. So we've got this else tag in Django, which, if the if is not true, then else we can show them some other content. So this is kind of a graceful degradation here, I guess. We're not actually able to show them the application, but at least we can explain why they can't see the application. Oh, sorry. So the end if has to go after the else because that's part of the whole if statement. All right, so now I try to load this page with is logged in false. And so we're getting that alternate text. You must be logged in to read my blog. Whereas, alternatively, if I were logged in, we get the full bio for Alice. All right, so that's cool. That's some basic templating stuff. Let's make another page, show some slightly more advanced concepts here. Now for the actual blog where you get to read our articles. Again, we're going to take in a request. All right, so again, I've referred to a file that doesn't exist. So I'm just going to create that real quick. So here, we're going to imagine we're going to get a list of blog posts. We want to iterate over them. We want to print every blog post that Alice has published. So we're going to say for posts and posts. Okay, so here I'm looping over an array, looping over a list of posts. I haven't defined these posts yet. So right now this template is not going to work because this data is not actually being passed in. So let me define these posts real quick. I don't think you all need to watch me type it. So I'm going to just paste these in here real quick. So kind of similar to yesterday, we're using a list of dictionaries as our data source just to demonstrate some templating concepts today. We've got a list, 3 dictionaries in it, each with a blog post. They've got a title, they have content and a date. Pretty standard blogging stuff. So now, remember our template doesn't automatically know about this data. We have to pass it in explicitly. So I'm going to give it some posts, value of posts. Just those guys are passing it right in. So now let's see how that renders. Actually, did I make a URL for this? Let me double check that. There's the view function. Okay, reading the URLs. No, I did not. So that's also important. I defined a function that handles this request, but I didn't actually say what route it should be handling requests at. So path log. It's going to be views.log. All right. Now this should work. Let's take a look at that. Cool. So this is a blog. I'm repeating some HTML from a list. And so this is basically the third basic problem in templating, is just rendering content in a loop. So I've got, my list of data, I've got my HTML, but I only had to write this markup once, all the H1s and the paragraph tags, I only have to write it once. And then my templating system is able to copy this for every element in my array. So I know what we've talked about so far is basic. This is kind of review from the previous days. But my point is that this is core. This is the fundamental skills you need for templating. If you're struggling with any of these 3 things, either variable interpolation, conditional rendering, or rendering in a loop, you should probably practice those things. And if you feel good about those, then great. You probably know enough about templating to build basically any kind of front end. There are other features that the Django templating system provides, but they're kind of like nice to haves. So let me give you an example of that. So in the Django template system, we have what are known as filters. So let me just double check. Okay. So let's say I don't actually want to render post.title, but I want to pass post.title into a function and then return the output of that function. So this is useful for like formatting data. If you want to format something as currency, format dates in a specific format, or in this case, if you just want to capitalize letters in a string. So if you want to title case a string that is capitalized the first letter of every word, Django has this built-in helper function, this built-in filter, they call it, called title. So I use a pipe, and that means pass the output of this thing, pass the output of this thing into the input of this thing, and then the output of that should actually be rendered on the screen. So you can see here some of these post titles, lowercase c, lowercase w, all these lowercase letters here. Maybe that's not how I actually want to present this content. Now, after I refresh the page, you can see that Django filter is capitalizing all these letters. So that's a nice little trick. It might save me some time, but it doesn't really let me do anything that I couldn't have already done in Python. So if you didn't know about this pipe title, like you could have still achieved this in Python. But if you don't know about for loops or variable interpolation, you're going to have a really tough time. Now, there are also ways that we can combine a lot of these techniques together, the for and the if. So let's go back to views. Let's say we want to add some extra data into this request here. We're going to take some data from the query string. So all these posts are in different years. Maybe people aren't really interested in my oldest posts. They just want to get the new stuff. So we're going to let the users specify a year. They're only going to get things after that year. So we're going to expect a get parameter in the URL called year. Pass it in here. And then back in my template, so now that year data is accessible to us, and I can use that in an if statement. So now I'm combining a condition with my loop. I'm rendering a full list, all the blog posts. But there is extra conditions. So here, year is 1888. All of my blog posts are newer than that. But if I go for year 2000, it's only going to show me my 2 blog posts that are after Y2K. Maybe a slightly strange example, but I can actually type in something like that, 2021-09. And so it's only showing me this one blog post that is after 2021-09, because it's in 2021-11-20. So here we're able to filter a large list. So imagine you've used dashboards on lots of websites that have a table with all your data that you use. And so they'll often have lots of filters on them. And this is one way that you can apply filters to a list of data by just toggling these if statements in your templates. All right, so I know this is kind of basic stuff. Does anybody have any questions before we do some cooler stuff in just a moment?
So basically, it's say if that was a filtered option, would every time you make a new filter request, that'd be you'd be making a new get request for the page to be re-rendered?
Right, because this is a server-side rendered page. So that's just, how the web used to work. Like if you use, I don't know if any of you guys have ever used WordPress. This is definitely how WordPress works. And it's kind of something that's a little bit frustrating about it, honestly. But there are lots of tables in WordPress, but it's all server-side rendered. So if you click a column, you say, hey, this is sorted alphabetically A to Z, but I want it alphabetical Z to A. WordPress can do that for you, but it has to refresh the entire page and generate a whole new table to do that. So yeah, in this case, we're using server-side rendered pages. So it's got to go back to the server and generate all new HTML every time I change this query string. Okay, so let's talk about repeated content, or a little bit more actually. So we got a few hands up.
So this isn't like directly related to what we're talking about right now, but I was just wondering if we could demonstrate something real quick, because there were a couple of people yesterday that were asking questions about the yellow errors that we're getting in all of these Python files. And that was like with the missing imports for Django modules. And that was also something that was like bugging me. So I kind of like dug into it and figured out why that's happening. And the reason is like, if you see on the bottom where it says Python and then the version number, that's basically the interpreter that VS Code is currently using, but that interpreter is not the Python interpreter inside our virtual environment. So it technically doesn't have access to any of the Django stuff. So if you go down there and like click on it.
This guy?
No, the 3.9.7. And then you go to interpreter path. And then basically you just have to type the path to your virtual environment there. And then specifically /bin/Python. And then enter. And then you'll see at the bottom, it says that it's using the templating virtual environment and the errors have resolved.
Looks like it. Very cool. Thanks for showing me that. Okay, so I'm gonna add another feature into our blog here. We're gonna have a subscribe button. Or Andrew, what's up?
Oh, I just forgot to put it down.
It just popped up your name again for me. Were there other hands up? Oh, right. Okay, so I've added a new component, this please subscribe button. When you click on it, it gives you this alert. Thanks for subscribing. We're going to pretend that it's actually much more complicated than it is. But imagine like on Facebook, you've got that like button. It's just one button you click, but you've got to trust that it's very complicated because it like connects to everything else on Facebook. Because they're always comparing how you like things to how other people like things. There's a lot of logic that just goes into that like button. So let's imagine this is a very complicated component. And Alice is really selling this hard, so she's going to put this on multiple pages. She's going to put it there and also on her blog. So I want to use this same button again. So I'll just copy paste it. But now, I guess I just said it, but what's wrong with what I just did?
It's dry.
Redundant.
Someone have any ideas?
It's dry.
Yeah, this is not very dry. So the same concepts still apply. We do not want to be repeating ourselves for all the same reason why dry is important in object-oriented code. We're going to have to use slightly different techniques to use dry code for our templates. So I'm going to define a new file just for this button. I'm going to call it subscribe.html. And so this is not going to be a full HTML document. This is a partial, is one way you can call it, because it's just part of an HTML document. Let's grab that guy, put him right in there. And then in the index, we'll remove it as well. Now, instead of just hard coding in the button itself, we're going to use some more advanced syntax here. Include, and then we'll just name another HTML template. So again, in my templates folder, there's a blog folder and then a subscribe.html file. So I'm going to include that here. And then I will also include it in the blog. So now when I go back to my blog, we have the subscribe button at the bottom. Thanks for subscribing. Great. When I go to the home page, I'm refreshing, still the same situation. We have the subscribe button at the bottom, but I've only had to define it once. So imagine in the future, if the boss comes in and says that button's ugly, we got to add some bootstrap to it, put some rounded corners on it, maybe change the alert message. I don't have to go and update this on every page. I only have to change this one button. So that's very convenient. So in your homework for tonight, you'll be challenged to kind of think about repeating markup that you have in your page, just HTML that repeats across different pages, and thinking about how you can use include in order to reduce the complexity of that in order to avoid repeating yourself. Another really great thing about include is imagine if this button was much bigger, if this was 100 lines of code to create a button. In my index.html, I don't want to see 100 lines of code right here just for this super complex button. I just want to think like, okay, that's a button. I can click on it. I know how it works, and just include it with a single line of code. If I want to dig more into the details, the complexity, I can look at its own individual HTML file. But for the most part, I don't need to dig that deep. So using includes like this helps you kind of separate complexity from the big picture, helps keep your individual files smaller and more manageable. But we've still got some problems here. Can people see anything else that's repeated across my different templates here between the blog and the index?
Your HTML head includes links.
Yeah, so all this HTML head, like a lot of HTML boilerplate that is repeated. Now let's say I want to have like a title for my page. This is pretty commonly something that you'd want to have the same on every page, or at least the same on most pages. So now you can see the tab title changed. Welcome to my blog. But it's not consistent. I made a mistake here and I didn't make it the same on every page. Ideally, it should be the same on every page. And I could use include, but there's a more efficient option here. Since the title is not only the same on every page, but it's also in the same location in every page, there's a more efficient way that I can declare this. I would say that the title, along with like the head and the body and the HTML element, these are part of my layout. All of the elements that are the same on every page of my website and are in the same place in every page of my website, that's my layout. Excuse me. So I want to define once all those static items that are the same on every page. And then for the other pages, only define the things that are interesting and different about that page. So I said before, this is my layout. Call this layout.html. And this is just going to have the elements that are common to all of my other pages. So the HTML, head, now let's say I want to have a header, that this is going to be on every page of my site. I'll put that here. Generally, you want to have some navigation on every page so you can get around to the other pages. Okay, so these are the features that are going to be the same on every page of my site. And then I have to define the places where the unique content actually goes. These are called blocks. Kind of a generic name for the first block is just content. So I'm going to say block content. And then you also have to end it. You'll see in a second why it's important to end it. But this is saying that in all of my other files, whatever their main content is, it goes here in between these two tags here for block content and end block. So now let's adapt one of our other files so that it meets this format so we can actually plug it into this layout file. So I'm going to get rid of all the redundant stuff. HTML head, title head, get rid of the body HTML, don't need none of that. Unindent this now. But now I need to define what this content is and where it fits into the layout. So the way we do this is at the top of the file. We use another Django template tag, extends. So this has to go at the top of the file, and extends is kind of like the opposite of includes. So if you say, one file includes another, file A includes file B, that means you're putting file B into file A. If you say that file A extends file B, that means you're putting file A into file B. The one that is being extended is the layout. It has, the header and the footer. The one that is doing the extending has all of the unique contents. So here I put this tag at the top, extends blog/layout.html. And then I declare where my blocks are inside of here. Call this block content. And then the very bottom, end the block. So now this here is my content block. Again, block is a keyword in the Django template system. Content is just an arbitrary name that I came up with to name this block. But so this is my content block for the index.html. And if I've got this all set up correctly, when I load the index.html, it'll first load layout.html and then insert the content block from the index right here where it says block content. Cool. So it looks like that's working. We can see the specific content from the index, but also the generic content from the layout. Now, in order to actually make this meaningful, to make us like actually make this dry so that we're saving work, I need to update all my other templates so they also use the layout. So I'm going to apply this to the blog. Delete HTML, add title, add body, body. All right, so I've done the same thing to my blog now. Oh, right. That's supposed to be end block.
You need to extend the block up there.
I mean,
No, I think it's the year query string. It's mandatory.
it's the year.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do here, I'm going to show you another little Django templating utility. We're going to use a default. And just a second. So this is saying that if year is not defined, just use the string 1900 instead. So here I go to the blog without a query string, and then it's just using 1900 instead of the year. So that's going to show me all of my posts because the earliest one is 1997. Although it does seem that we're not extending layout. Oh, right, because I didn't actually say that this extends layout. So that's also important. Which I mean, it's the first thing you need to do if you're building a layout like this. Okay, there we go. So we're at Alice's awesome blog. It's got 2 links. I can go home, order the blog, and it's got the same header. I only have to define it once. I don't even have to include it multiple times. It's just everything else extends layout, and then they know that that's where things go in the layout. Now, if you're wondering, why do we have this end block here? Why is there nothing inside of here? That's because we can have default values for these blocks. So let me show you here. I'll have another block here. So here I've got a block that's declared, but I've also put content inside of it. So generally speaking, you don't put content in the layout. This is just defining the blocks. This is defining where content goes. And then the individual pages like index and blog would define the actual content that goes inside of there. But here, this is defining a default. So now for the home page, I didn't define a title block. For the blog, I did not define a title block, but it still takes the default from the layout. But if I want to, I can override that. So like in the index, here's my block. Sorry, here's my block for content. So I'm just going to make another block. Doesn't even really matter what order I have these in because they're all named. What an awesome blog. So this title, I'm overriding the default only for the index. So on /blog, we still see the title as this is my blog. When I go home, we're overriding that default with what an awesome blog. So this is a pretty common use case. Every page on your site should have a title set. It's really good for SEO. And often most of them will be exactly the same, but only a couple of them will be different. So this is a pretty simple way that you can set 99% of your title tags to be exactly the same thing and still make it easy to override in situations where you need to. We got a couple hands up. Kat, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the layout for the layout HTML. Is there a reason why you put the block content like inside the unordered list versus outside of it?
Because that was a mistake. That was why I put it inside of the unordered.
Oh, okay.
Great
Sorry,
question.
I just
Thank you
wanted
for
to see if I was missing something. Thanks.
Do we have another question?
Yes, so that secondary or that second keyword, I guess, behind block, so content and title, that could be like any variable like donuts or anything.
Right. Could be
Okay.
donuts as long as it matches. So if I wanted this to be block donuts, that's totally fine as long as the templates that are going to get plugged in here also have a matching block. So call this block donuts. And then in the blog, block donuts. And everything should work exactly the same. Marcus? Did you?
I didn't put my hand down. That was my question.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Zoom is weird sometimes about showing me people's names. Courtney?
Was it the extends that's linking the URL? Or like the link buttons? That makes sense.
I'm sorry, connecting which buttons?
I guess, can you just like go through where, sorry, my phone's going crazy. Go through where it's connecting again. As far as on the page when you click, can you go back to your browser? Like when you click home and blog, where is that in the code that's where it's going back and forth?
Oh, sure. So in the layout, that's my nav bar that I defined. Oh yeah, unordered list, a couple list items. This is going slash, this is going to /blog. Just simple URLs. Cool. Do you have a follow-up question about that?
Yeah, and then so the blog that's going to that blog HTML, which is then having your block content, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep, cool. You're welcome. Other question?
Yeah, you had said to override the title. You had put somewhere in there the what an awesome blog or something. I wasn't seeing that show up in the index anywhere. it still says, welcome to my blog.
The title is up here.
Oh, I see. It's up there in the tab. Okay.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because most humans honestly won't read it. Like they almost always get cut off, but they're important for search engines and search engine optimization. So technically speaking, a proper website should have a title tag set for every page.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on what I've shown today? I know a lot of it was review, some of it was basic, but it's really include and primarily extends, honestly, is the real power tools when it comes to templating. Extends is just a very powerful concept. It exists in most templating languages, and if not, you can implement it without too much difficulty. And like this is really, I think, the most powerful concept in templating that enables you to make dry templates. It enables you to avoid repeating your markup so that you can change something once and have it apply everywhere. Definitely a very important concept to be familiar with. So I want to show you real quick. In tonight's homework, I'm going to ask you to use Bootstrap a little bit, not because this is really a styling focused exercise, but just because the Bootstrap components are big, they have a lot of HTML, and I want you to just get comfortable with dealing with large hunks of HTML, but I don't want you to just spend hours writing it by hand. So let's look at some of these components. You're going to build a website for a startup that's selling some exciting new product. So let's think about typical things you see on startup websites. Carousel, I think, is pretty common. They want to show you, pictures of people using the product, or maybe a list of testimonials or whatever. But if you look at the code for the carousel, you might notice this is very wet code. So, for every picture, there's this carousel item active, D block, W100, whatever, a lot of repeated markup here for just, and a list of images. It's like only the source and maybe even the alt are different, but you probably don't even need the alt. So really just the source is different between all these items. So I'm going to ask you to pick a few Bootstrap components of your choice, but hopefully you choose the bigger, more complex ones, and then think about how you can make your markup more dry. Try to use this Bootstrap component, but if you use it twice, don't just copy and paste it twice, maybe try using includes. And then within it, don't just like copy and paste all this HTML for each individual image. You could use like a for loop inside of your Bootstrap component. Similarly with the accordion. If you look at the accordion code, these are very powerful. I love them, but this is very wet code. If you're going to have like a 10-question FAQ, you're looking at like a few pages of HTML, and that's just kind of hard to read, hard to scroll through. So you might want to use a for loop to generate the content inside of this accordion. So you notice each of these divs is very similar. Each of these accordion item divs or the collapse items, you can probably see some patterns in here, and then maybe use a for loop in the Django templates in order to render this full accordion from like a list of data instead of hard coding every single div in H2 or whatever that's in here. People see what I'm talking about? I'm just trying to help us manage just the sheer size of these Bootstrap components and avoid repeating ourselves. And the main way you're going to be doing that is using for loops, includes, and extends. So yeah, I know I'm keeping you kind of late. Sorry that this lecture went over quite a bit, but do any people have any last minute questions before we break for lunch today? Sukhdev?
Hi, so what we just did, is that server-side rendering?
Yeah,
Then?
everything that we've done today is server-side rendering. So I hope you appreciate everything that you're doing today and this week, and then you can compare these experiences this week with what we do in React later. And you might decide for yourself that one's easier than the other, or one is more flexible or powerful. You'll form your own preferences. Although I would say that most likely whatever job you get as a junior developer, like they're paying you to do client-side rendering. That's like a marketable, trendy skill. Like a lot of junior developers will have a single page application as like their only project on their resume. So I think if you had to focus on one style, it's probably more profitable to be good at client-side rendering, because I think that's a more trendy in-demand skill, and it's just harder in general. But it's important to understand that these are both options and there are trade-offs. Do we have any other last-minute questions? All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening, being engaged, asking the questions. I hope this was easy enough to follow along. You find it useful and you're able to apply it to your exercises. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about these concepts. It might take you a few minutes to wrap your head around the includes versus extends dichotomy. But I think this should be accessible, should be powerful and fun. So I hope you all enjoy the homework tonight. So yeah, if there are no more questions, let's take a good long lunch, maybe come back at 1:30 and then get started on the exercises for tonight. Shouldn't be any more content this afternoon, no guest lectures or whatever. All right, take care, everybody.